Rajim, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm sure that you had a very informative session today. I know that it's been quite long, but alhamdulillah, we had very esteemed speakers, and I'm sure that you've learned a lot about mental illness in general, and of course about depression and anxiety as well. My topic for today is on the dangers of misdiagnosing mental illness, and I'm going to approach this topic, inshallah, from two different perspectives. The first perspective is by look at the misdiagnosis in terms of professionals diagnosing mental illness incorrectly. So in order to understand diagnosis a bit better, let me give you a background into how mental illness is diagnosed in the psychological and psychiatric field. Many people might believe that diagnosis is just about, seeing a person once and then giving them a diagnosis or looking at symptoms. But there's actually quite a process that we need to go through in order to diagnose. And I want you to just bear in mind why this is important. It becomes very dangerous as soon as someone is given a diagnosis. This starts to shape their life. It starts to shape their relationships with others. It impacts on their self-esteem and their view of themselves. So diagnosis is not something that we should take lightly. And it's not something that's easy to do, and neither does it happen once off in one session. The major ways in which we diagnose mental illness is through basically two sources or two manners that we go about doing this. The first is to look at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Professionals or practitioners call this the DSM for short, and we are now at the 5th version of this particular manual. So this is basically a manual that gives us a breakdown of all the mental disorders as well as symptoms. And very important, it's not just about symptoms, it's also about the duration at which the symptoms last. It's dependent on other factors such as was there a previous mental illness. So the DSM is a manual that gives us a breakdown on this. And similar to the DSM is what we call the ICD, or the International Classification of Diseases. The DSM was conducted or brought about by the American Psychiatric Association. And the ICD is similar in nature. It's also a manual that gives us a breakdown of what the diseases should be about. But this was created by the World Health Organization. So we have these two sources, and practitioners usually alternate between these two, depending on what context you're in. Some people prefer to use the DSM over the ICD, but this is one source only. And I'm emphasizing this because we need to understand that the issue of diagnosis is not simple. And it's very important that we understand this because of the trends that we're seeing happening in today's time. The other means or manner in which we go about diagnosing is through psychological assessment. So psychological assessment tools are your questionnaires, your surveys, these kind of tests. But I need to just explain this a little bit, and I'll go into this a little bit in detail so that we understand that when we talk about psychological assessment, it is not the same thing as getting some questions on a mobile app or going onto a website and finding a questionnaire and then making a self-diagnosis. I'm going to get to this topic a bit later on in my talk today, but it's very important that we understand the background of psychological assessment. And this in itself is entrenched within research, and it's a very rigorous procedure, which I will explain some of the issues that are important in assessment in a short while, inshallah. So just to recap, the two ways in which practitioners usually diagnose is through either the DSM or the ICD, and then using psychological assessment tools. So when I speak about the DSM, we need to understand that these manuals itself, both the ICD and the DSM, are strongly entrenched in research. And the first version of the DSM, for example, was created in 1952, and it's been updated based on research, based on trends in society. there's been various versions or updates to it. And we're now currently at the DSM-5, and this is continuously a work in progress. I'm going to emphasize this again, because people tend to feel that, just reading some symptoms on a website or getting some, insight into, like it's a checklist that you can just tick off and decide whether this is a diagnosis or not. And we need to understand that even the manuals that practitioners are using is constantly being researched. It's been a work in progress for a very long time. The first version of the ICD, for example, the ICD came before the DSM. This was in 1893. And so there's been more than a decade of extensive research on diseases, on how to analyze diseases, on the interpretation of various diseases, because whether it's mental illness or physical illness, we cannot understand a disorder or a disease without understanding the situation, the context in which it's occurring, the duration in which it's occurring, the history of the person, and so on. I'll move on now to psychological assessment tools. So there are common psychological assessment tools that we use for diagnosis, and this is a worldwide trend. Generally, what happens is there's consistency in the type of tools that people are using from context to context. So I've just put some names of popular tools that we commonly use, but this list is by no means all that's out there. There's quite a bit of psychological assessment tools. The important thing to note is that these tests or these tools are just meant to be a screening. Now, when it comes to psychological assessment, we have to be aware that psychological assessment in itself is not the same thing as testing. It's not the same thing as taking one test, getting a result, and then deciding on it. Why am I saying this? The difference between what we call psychological assessment and testing is that psychological assessment is an entire process. It starts out with a history-taking interview. It includes observations by clinical practitioners who need to be registered. It also includes testing. So there are obviously various tests that will be used, but we never ever use tests in isolation. So when we're assessing a patient or a client to determine whether they have depression or anxiety or any other mental disorder, it never happens in isolation. It's always occurring together, and we call it a battery of tests. So we're using more than one test, we're using more than one method. So for example, we might use the DSM as well as psychological assessment. We might use various types of psychological assessment in addition to the type of tools that I have or the type of tests that I have on the screen. We might also use what we call emotional screening or projective tests, where people's underlying emotions will get projected onto very neutral stimuli like an ink blot or a picture card. So there's quite a bit that goes into a psychological assessment instead of just taking a test. Again, I'm emphasizing this so that people understand the difference when they're exposed to these type of things on the internet or through apps or whatever it is. In terms of psychological assessments, these are regulated. These tests might look the same as what you see on the internet or what you might find on apps or websites or whatever it is, but psychological assessment tools are generally regulated by a health body or a health professions council, depending on who's in charge of psychology in the different contexts. So these instruments need to be valid. So this means that it needs to be an instrument that measures what it's supposed to be measuring. It also needs to be reliable. So the results need to be consistent. If I'm using it with one person, I should be getting the same results over and over. It also has to be precise, and it has to be free from bias. Now, this is very important. The test that we create, the test that we're using, we have to take into consideration the context of the person's cultural background, their social situation. If we do not consider this, then we run the risk of using unfair tests. And I have an example here. If someone takes a depression test, or if someone is given a depression test and it's conducted in English, but this person's first language is not in English, then what's going to happen is that we run in the risk of having unfair results and inaccurate diagnosis, because we don't know whether the person has understood the items on that particular tool the way that they're supposed to, because it's not in the language that they understand best. So it's very important when we're using these kind of tests and tools that we have to bear these things in mind. It looks as if it's the same thing when we just finding something, or a checklist or questionnaire. And I've seen this trend happening very much recently, is that you have this influx of websites and mobile apps, and some of them even created by lay people to evaluate depression and anxiety particularly. And what happens is that it may look the same as the psychological assessment tools we're having, but all these other factors that need to be taken into account. Is it applicable to the person? Has it been regulated? Is it used ethically? These are very important elements in terms of assessment that we have to be able to pay attention to. And we don't just make a diagnosis. We look at all of these things, take it into consideration before actually making a diagnosis. So I hope that explains the way in which diagnosis is usually made. A last note on this is who can use psychological assessment tools and how are they used? So we know that in any context, it doesn't matter what country you're in, registered and licensed professionals only are allowed to use these type of tools. And there's a reason for that, of course, because it's so open to misrepresentation and misunderstanding. And really, I think that everyone can relate to this, that as soon as you give yourself, or somebody gives you a psychological label, whether that's a label of depression or anxiety, as soon as we have these labels, it starts determining the way in which you live your life and the way in which you see yourself. So it's very, very crucial that only licensed professionals are allowed to use these type of tools. These restrictions are even based on registration. So even some professionals within the field of psychology, they might have expertise in one area, they still won't be allowed to use these kind of tests because they don't have the expertise to be able to diagnose. So I think that I'm trying to emphasize the importance of a diagnosis, why it is that we have to be very careful. As I mentioned, tests are never used in isolation. We always use it as part of a process. And the reason for this is because one test result might not be accurate. So it is not enough to take a test, get a diagnosis saying you are majorly depressed, or you have moderate depression, or your anxiety levels are high. It is not enough to base those decisions and conclusions on one test only, because there's various factors that might come into play. As I mentioned, is the test accurate? Does it actually match the person's context? Has it taken into account who it's been normed on? Sometimes psychological assessment tools are normed on one population and applied to other populations, and the results are just not applicable or not transferable. And I'll give you an example. We have what we call a clinical personality assessment that measures different elements of personality. And there's a scale on this questionnaire that measures levels of dependency. And this is abnormal dependency. But what we found was that people from collectivist cultures, people who place emphasis on family and community, they always score high on this dependency scale. Now, does it mean that they are dependent individuals who aren't able to commit anything on their own, or aren't able to conduct tasks on their own? It doesn't mean this. It's if we don't understand their context, then we're going to label this person as being dependent when they might be really independent, but they're just part of a collective society, and they consider other people. So you see why it's very dangerous for us to just use tests and give diagnosis and we don't understand the implications. And the implications are very important because it's not just about giving a label. It's not just about saying you have depression. Something happens after that. As soon as someone hears that they have depression, it's the same as a physical disorder. If I was diagnosed with a particular disorder today, it's going to change the way in which I see my life, the way in which I live my life. It's going to have an impact on my relationships with others. And this is the exact same thing when it comes to diagnosis of mental disorders. We place a lot of results on labels. It determines the way in which we live our lives. And if tests are used, if any form of inaccurate means have been used to diagnose or to self-label or come to these conclusions, then we understand why it's very dangerous. So what if we get diagnosis wrong? And remember, I'm speaking here from a point of professionalism. What if professionals get diagnosis wrong? And there are cases where this happens sometimes. What are some of the effects of getting diagnosis wrong? So firstly, of course, we understand that it's going to increase emotional distress. It might possibly increase the symptoms. It might also bring on the onset of further disorders. We call this comorbidity in the mental health field, where two disorders are occurring at the same time. The patient might become more confused. They might have feelings of hopelessness. Allah forbid, but they might even turn to suicide because they feel so hopeless. The person or the people that they put their hope in to help them is actually making things more difficult. So they lose trust in mental health professionals. Sometimes if it's a misdiagnosis and in terms of psychiatric medication, there's a possibility that incorrect medication is given. And then of course, this brings about detrimental side effects. Of course, for professionals, this could bring about legal action, and people, have the right to be able to take legal action against practitioners who misdiagnose. Now, this is very important, and I think the level of misdiagnosis with professionals obviously is less than lay people, because professionals obviously firstly have a background knowledge and expertise. Secondly, they have accountability to a health board or to some sort of regulation. So they have to follow ethical procedure. They have to make sure that they work in the best interest of the individuals that they're working with. But we have a new challenge, and this is something that's been on the rise recently, with the influx of the internet. And alhamdulillah, the internet and mobile technology is a wonderful thing, but it also can be very detrimental, and it can have very negative effects. So we have this issue of self-diagnosis. And I think that many of you would be able to relate to this when I say this. For some people, as soon as we start feeling something or something goes wrong, what happens is we go to the internet and start looking for symptoms, and we do this with our physical health as well. So we have this new trend where people are seeking help through the internet, through mental health online platforms, or through mobile apps. And you have an influx of mobile apps. I'm not going to mention any of them, but there's a lot of them that claim to be able to help you to deal with your depression and anxiety. And I'm not saying all of them are bad, so please don't think that I'm saying it's not useful or not bad. What I'm saying is that it runs the risk of misdiagnosis, and it's just something that we should take caution on. So there's also this trend where celebrities and influential people have become very aware of mental illness, and they're very vocal of mental illness and speak out about their own mental illnesses on platforms such as Instagram and Facebook, and they speak about their mental illness, and it makes other people feel like this is something almost glamorized and something that is okay for all of us. And what happens is you have lots of people today, and it is a growing trend, coming out and saying, I also have depression and I also have anxiety, without an actual diagnosis and without seeking any assistance or assessment or anything like that from a professional. what also happens is, you know, a lot of these mobile apps or these websites will have screening tools. And at the end of the screening tool, it will tell you, you have depression and you need to seek help. And although they have this disclaimer to say, you know, you should seek help from a mental professional or mental health professional, but the diagnosis has already been given, the label has already been placed on this person. And we need to understand what happens in the brain. Sheikh West was speaking earlier about how the brain controls emotions, and what happens in the brain as soon as we hear a label, or we get this result to say you are depressed or you are anxious or you have anxiety or any other mental disorder, the brain has already processed this and the impact is already there. Most people don't understand the implications or the need for a rigorous assessment. And so it looks the same to you. And you might think, you know, why do I need to spend money seeing a mental health professional when I can just take this test online or just download this app and follow these suggestions on my phone? And I think I'm hoping that you understand from today's talk that it's really not the same thing. So we also have self-labels, and just related to my earlier point about celebrities and so on coming out and, you know, speaking out about mental illness, a lot of people feel the need to follow important people or influential people. And so if I'm a celebrity and I come out and say I have depression or anxiety and I have followers, you know, it's very likely that these people are going to come out and might have similar symptoms and start self-labeling and self-diagnosing, which of course becomes very dangerous because, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just about symptoms, it's also about duration, it's about a background, it's about the family background, the history, the context, all these various factors that need to be taken into consideration. There's also this reliance on lay people for diagnosis. And I think this is, I'm coming to the end of my talk. This is one of my final points. If you just take a quick read through on forums, such as Reddit or Quora on the internet, and you have this growing trend where people will be asking each other for advice on depression. So you have questions such as, you know, did anyone else go through depression? Did anyone else deal with depression using so-and-so means or whatever it is? And you have lay people giving advice. And I actually wanted to add some of the screenshots, but maybe it's better if I don't do that. If you're really interested, try and do this for yourself. You know, just Google depression and you're going to see this trend where people start asking each other, you know, have you had depression? How have you dealt with it? And you have lay people giving advices, giving a discussion, and this increases the risk of misdiagnosis. You know, people may not accurately describe their symptoms, they may not accurately understand their symptoms, and even if they do accurately understand symptoms, as I mentioned already, it's not just about symptoms. So we understand that very detrimental effects can occur, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't be going to these platforms, but there is a grave danger in self-diagnosis. There's a grave danger in you know, trying to deal with your own mental illness by yourself. Another point that I found very pertinent by Sheikh West earlier was when he said that the help has been put there by Allah and mental health professionals have been trained. And I think any mental health professional will tell you that it's a very intense and rigorous training and a very difficult field, because it's very important that we know how to work with people properly to avoid things such as misdiagnosis. So in conclusion, we can see that misdiagnosis, whether it's by a professional or anyone else, has detrimental and often long-term effects. There's been many cases reported where it may even go as far as people committing suicide because of a misdiagnosis. So we need to understand that people with mental illness, they're already feeling vulnerable, they're already feeling fragile, and there is this desperation to get help, but there's the right channels to get help. For example, you have Solace online counseling services, which is very confidential, but depending on whatever context you are, there are even free services to get help for psychological disorders and mental health. So it's advisable that you seek help from registered and trained mental professionals, so that we're reducing this risk of self-diagnosis and misdiagnosis. So I think in conclusion, we can understand that diagnosis is not a simple thing. It doesn't happen once off. It often takes many sessions of therapy and a whole process of assessment to determine a diagnosis. And even then, there's still a risk of getting it wrong. So inshallah, I hope that this has made us understand that mental health diagnosis should only be made by qualified professionals, people who have knowledge and expertise in the field, and people who work within formal and ethical boundaries, so that we look, as humans, we can never take away the risk of things like misdiagnosis because of the human factor. We have that level of error, but we would like to reduce the error as much as possible. So that brings me to the end of today's talk. Jazakallah khairan. It's been a pleasure being able to share something with you, and I hope that it's been of benefit to everyone, inshallah. I don't know if there's time for any questions or if there are any questions, but that's all from me. Jazakallah khairan.